Hey class, how are you doing? This is our Circulatory Responses lecture, and if you want to, you could probably read through Chapter 9 in your textbook faster than I'm going to go through this lecture. I will try to go through it quickly because there's really only a few points that I want us to know. I'm sure in other classes you've gone relatively in depth on the circulatory and cardiovascular system. So for this lecture, I'm going to try to keep this to, keep in mind exercise and what we're trying to do during exercise. So maintaining blood pressure, delivering nutrients, delivering oxygen, all sorts of that stuff. So what I'm going to be talking about is the main purposes of the cardiovascular system. Well, in our next lecture, I'll get to respiration. I'm going to talk just a bit about organization and structure. So some of the differences between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. A little bit about cardiomyocytes, which is just a heart muscle cell, right? Then I'll talk about the cardiac cycle, so the contraction, relaxation, and within that, I'm going to talk about blood pressure, systolic, diastolic. I'll refer to that as systole, diastole. If you don't know what that is, I will define it soon. Next, the electrical system. So, SA node, AV node, bundle of Higgs, Purkinje fibers, those things that hopefully you've heard in other classes, but I will reiterate it to you. Next, some stuff about cardiac output and how that's maintained, and that's going to tie really well into the Fick equation that we've gone over quite a few times in class. Well, just how different aspects of cardiac output are maintained or how they respond to exercise and exercise training. So what happens whenever we get more trained. And then lastly, I'm going to cover some aspects about blood and how that alters through exercise, and some hemodynamics going forward. So here, let's go ahead and get into some of that. So starting off, the circulatory system, it works with the pulmonary system, and frequently it's called the cardiopulmonary, cardiorespiratory system. And for those of you that are somewhat interested in that, most of the textbooks I read, cardiopulmonary is more in relation to disease. At least that's what it appears from reading of numerous textbooks and studies about it. And cardiorespiratory seems to be a little bit more leaning towards performance. Now, they both mean the same thing, just that's the verbiage that's used in different types of fields. But here is a really main point that I want us to know is the purposes of the cardiorespiratory system. So I think that this first part is somewhat obvious, like transport of oxygen and nutrients to tissues. Also removing or removal of waste products, CO2 being in particular one of the most important ones. Lastly, regulation of body temperature. There are chapters in your book related to environmental adaptations, mostly focusing on how we adapt to heat, and our circulatory system has quite a bit to do with that, like taking so-called hot blood from our more internal organs, taking it more towards our peripheral organs so that the heat doesn't damage our like say our heart or liver, all sorts of things like that. And overall, our next point on this slide, there's two major adjustments of blood flow during exercise. So the first one being increased cardiac output. So meaning more blood is getting pumped out of the heart per minute. That's all that means. And lastly, there's a redistribution of blood flow. So we will funnel blood or direct it towards tissues or organs that are being very active compared to tissue or organs that are not being very active during exercise. So I think that this, one way to conceptualize that is if you're only exercising your biceps, there's going to be a massive increase in blood flow to your biceps and really nowhere else. We don't need more blood flow going to our kidneys whenever our biceps are really the main thing having the highest metabolic demand. So moving on just a little bit, some things that I think are a little bit obvious with this that I just want you to know. Heart. I think everyone knows what your heart is. In terms of adaptation, we mostly are concerned with what's going on with the left ventricle, which pumps blood systemically, meaning to everything outside of your heart and lungs. So the right ventricle pumps blood towards your lungs, and really in terms of exercise adaptation, that doesn't really adapt as much. The left ventricle adapts much more, and the atria don't adapt nearly as much as the left ventricle does. Next thing, arteries and arterioles. So these carry blood away from the heart capillaries. This is where exchange of oxygen, CO2, and various nutrients actually happen. Moving on, veins and venules. These carry blood towards the heart. And really, I guess if we're pointing out where most of the adaptation is actually happening, and this is mostly in relation to aerobic or cardiovascular exercise, there are branches in arteries, arterioles, but main thing is neocapillarization. So if a tissue has a high demand for oxygen and a high production of CO2, there will be a higher amount of growth of capillaries to try to feed whatever tissue that is, and a lot of this is stimulated by something called vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF. If you're interested in that, you can certainly look that stuff up, but the term is neocapillarization. There's also another term called angiogenesis, which is really just the production of, like more arteries, arterioles broadly. But neocapillarization is kind of the main thing that if you're interested in further reading, I think that would be important. Veins and venules, veins and venules, those are really just carrying blood away from the heart. Now here, the structure of the heart, hopefully everyone is more or less aware of how this works. I'm really not going to test you on too much of this because I'm assuming in structure and function, anatomy and physiology classes that you've been beat to death with this. But just broadly being aware that we have the vena cava, that's where things are coming in, then goes into the right atria, then through, you can call it the right arterioventricular node, or valve, or the tricuspid valve. I like the right AV, and on the other side, the bicuspid, the left AV, because that, to me, it says more where it is. But you can use any term. Many professors that I've had actually prefer the tri and bicuspid valves. And I believe there's an acronym to know where all of this is, but I don't recall it off the top of my head, so that's all right. So the right atrium, right AV valve, right ventricle, then the pulmonary semilunar valve, then it's going to come back into the over here. Well, I guess here is one of the only places where, say, the left pulmonary artery and, the right pulmonary artery, this is the only time that I can think of, at least, that artery has blue blood in it, so-called blue blood, right, which it's going away from the heart. That's really all that means. And then we've got red veins coming back, so pulmonary veins coming back in, left atria, right here, left AV, left ventricle, this one really big. You can tell right here in the myocardium how this is pictorially represented, that this muscle is really large, so it's going to shoot it out all the way from the top of your head to your toes, blood is what I'm talking about there. Then the aortic semilunar valve, and then it's going to go through this aortic arch and or aorta, whatever you want to call there. I'm not going to belabor these points too much more. Just be aware of those. That's the general structure of the heart. Two aspects to it. There's the pulmonary and systemic circuit. So just overall, the pulmonary circuit is the right side of the heart. And you can read the rest of this. It's deoxygenated blood trying to get it oxygenated. The systemic circuit, that's really where most of the busyness is going on for us, because it's going to be pumping the blood to your quads, your calves, your biceps, your throat, everywhere that you can possibly think of. And that's broadly the left side of the heart. So be aware of that. It's deoxygenated blood. I'm sorry. It will pump oxygenated blood and blood with various nutrients to get to everywhere within the body. And here is just a pictorial representation of this: the pulmonary circuit up here, the systemic circuit down here, and arteries, arterioles, capillaries, really big business happening here. Putting in O2, glucose, free fatty acids, picking up CO2, and various other things like lactate, whatever. All of that really important for what we're interested in going forward. Next stuff that I want us to be aware of, just a little bit about the muscle with the heart. The main one that I want us to be aware of is the myocardium. You can read more into the epi and endocardium. I'm not going to speak about it too much because their function in relation to exercise aren't, they are important, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of what I want us to know. Next thing, coronary arteries. The myocardium receives its blood flow from coronary arteries. And next thing, heart attacks or myocardial infarctions. This is just a blockage in coronary arteries, and exercise training seems to protect against it in some ways. Now, if you're interested in all of this, really good pictorial representation. This is in your book as well. Epicardium, myocardium, endocardium, really what's going on here. This myocardium is really what I'm more concerned with for us. But here are a couple of points that I want us to be aware of, I guess. Heart muscle and skeletal muscle are fairly similar. In many ways, yet pretty different in other ones. So one of the first things is skeletal muscle. We have type 1, 2A, 2X, all that stuff. Heart muscle seems to be relatively uniform, even though the contractile elements are still actin and myosin. The shape is a little bit different. Skeletal muscle, we talked about its multinucleation and mononuclear domain being supplied by satellite cells. That really isn't going on with heart muscle. It's single nucleated, or each cardiomyocyte, heart muscle cell, only has a single one. So they're both striated. One big thing here is they are somewhat all connected through something called intercalated discs. So this is more or less so that whenever one heart muscle cell gets the message to contract, it's going to be propagated to all of the ones near it. If you recall, like hormone cell signaling, it would be almost a juxtacrine response. So all the cells right next to it are going to get a signal to effectively contract, and everything working together. Whereas within skeletal muscle, it doesn't really work that way. It's more about like motor units, and just because one muscle cell in skeletal muscle is contracting doesn't mean the one next to it will. So there's something there. Also, it seems like the cell membranes of heart muscles are a little bit more leaky. So we could talk about the sodium-calcium exchanger. We won't, but it is different, and if you're interested in it, like action potentials look quite a bit different in cardiomyocytes. So if you just look that up, it's fairly interesting. But they're connected through intercalated discs. They have their cell membranes seem to be a little bit more leaky to ions compared to skeletal muscle. And some functional properties are they are almost entirely aerobic. They get calcium not only from their sarcoplasmic reticulum, but also extracellular calcium. That's the sodium-calcium exchanger that I was talking about. Also, neural control seems to be more involuntary, which, makes sense. We want that to happen. And for regeneration, not really satellite cells, but skeletal muscle does have satellite cells. Now, here, I used to have people read this on Valentine's Day. I don't believe I did it this year. Exercise training protects heart muscle. All I really want you to know here is that just 5 days or so of regular aerobic exercise seems to protect against damage to the heart if you have a heart attack. Here was the paper that I used to have people read, so Mechanisms of Exercise-Induced Cardioprotection. And I actually know all of these people except for Ashley. Scott Powers, he's the author of your book. Andreas Kavassis and John Quindry were both on my dissertation committee. So both wonderful humans. Those of you that call me Dr. K, Andreas Kavassis, he's my Dr. K. John Quindry, he's in Montana right now, and he's a very awesome dude. They wrote this paper kind of illustrating all of the improvements that happen whenever you exercise just for a few days. So you don't, if you knew you were going to have a heart attack this weekend, it would be a good idea to exercise Monday through Friday. And then you would have less heart damage. It effectively looks like this, but it's not so much untrained versus trained, even though that is true. It can be as acute as 5 days. So just look at that. That's fairly interesting in and of itself, I believe. All right, so going to try to be going a little bit faster here. The cardiac cycle. So we have a systolic and diastolic. So what these words mean, systole is just the contraction phase. So ejection of blood out of the heart, so that's a higher pressure. In another class, we do a lot more blood pressure taking and things. Diastole, this is the relaxation phase. So at rest, diastole is much longer than systole during exercise. Both of them are approximately the same length, and they both get shorter. So here's something that I want you to know right here. So if your heart is beating 75 beats per minute, then 0.3 seconds is in the contraction phase and 0.5 seconds is in the relaxation phase. Now, as we start exercising harder, so 180 beats per minute, then systole shrinks, but not that much, and diastole shrinks a lot. So one of the main things with how our body regulates our heart rate during exercise is we just have a shorter filling or relaxation window for our heart. So that's kind of what's going on there. So I might ask some type of question of which one of these shrinks more during exercise, systole or diastole, and the answer would be diastole, obviously, right? There are some pressure differences here. So you can read this whenever we take blood pressure, it's typically illustrated as systolic blood pressure in the numerator and diastolic blood pressure in the denominator. The typical one is 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, and what that is 120 being the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure being the 80. So we will always have a lower diastolic blood pressure than a systolic blood pressure. Now, if you've ever taken a stethoscope or you've felt your heart rate, the lub-dub sound, so the lub-dub sound The first sound is the closing of the AV valves, tribicuspid, and the second closing is of the aortic and pulmonary valves. So that's kind of what's going on there. Like whenever you hear the lub-dub, it's here's the lub, there's the dub. Yeah, I did just say that. Yep, that's okay. Okay, so kind of here, what's going on. Not too much that I want you to know about what's going on here, but just here's kind of the pressure phases. So somewhat higher pressure in systole. There's the first lub, there's the next dub sound, ventricles, and here is a little bit of a change in the volume. Not too much I want you to understand with that graph. You can look in the book more if you're interested in it. So here, just a couple of things related to blood pressure. So it's expressed as systolic over diastolic. Systolic blood pressure, already talked about what that is, and diastolic blood pressure, this is just the relaxation. Now, here's a new term for you, pulse pressure. This is the difference between the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, so 120 minus 80 would be that. And next thing would be the mean arterial pressure. So this is the average pressure in the arteries. So how that's calculated is just diastolic blood pressure plus a third systolic subtracted by diastolic, and that's mostly because systolic blood pressure is typically, like around a third of the diastolic blood pressure, about a third to 2/3, right there, if any of that makes sense. But really the main thing I want you to know is what pulse pressure is, which the difference in mean arterial pressure, which is just the average pressure going on there. I think all of us are somewhat aware of hypertension being a large issue. It's called the silent killer for many reasons. And there's primary and secondary hypertension. I'm not going to get into that too much, but there's a certain unknown cause, and there's a known cause in the secondary flavor of it. It's a risk factor for all sorts of stuff, but really what blood pressure, really high blood pressure does, if there is a particular organ or organ system that is weak in your body for whatever reason, genetic reasons, who cares? It's going to exploit that, and whatever your weakest link is, the high pressure on it is going to make it deteriorate faster. So it's going to make whatever that weak link is express as an issue later. So say if it's your kidneys, you're going to have kidney issues. If it's your brain, you're going to have stroke. If whatever. Hopefully that makes sense. So be somewhat aware of that. In other classes, I talk about how to take blood pressure. There's a lot of really interesting stuff with what's going on with the Korsakoff sounds. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but here there are some determinants of what our blood pressure is, and really some big aspects are cardiac output, which we'll get into is just heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, and then total vascular resistance. So effectively, how much resistance is being placed upon arteries, arterioles, capillaries, all sorts of things like that. Kind of think about it as your circulatory system is like a hose, and whatever is being pressed upon that is going to increase the resistance. So that's going to have a large impact on that. Now, there's some things that have short-term and long-term regulation. Generally, sympathetic nervous system. So here we think about, fight or flight, norepinephrine, those types of things, having a pretty large impact on short-term regulation. Also, baroreceptors, which really are just pressure receptors, detecting that. So they, if there's increase in blood pressure, there's going to be decrease sympathetic nervous system activity. A decrease there, sympathetic nervous system activity is going to happen there. Effectively, what's going on with that? That's just a negative feedback loop, to where if one goes up, the other has to go down, trying to maintain a relatively constant blood pressure. Long term, there is going to be blood volume control with the kidneys, so just, I don't know, be aware of that. But here, really good pictorial representation of factors influencing blood pressure. So, like, big things here, blood volume increases, heart rate increases, stroke volume increases, peripheral resistance, blood viscosity. So here, why exercise is such a good way to treat high blood pressure or hypertension is through a couple of things. From exercise, your blood volume does increase. So that is one of the adaptations. But one of the things with it is the fluid part versus the more thick, sticky part actually increases more, so blood viscosity will go down. So that will go up, blood volume will go up, blood viscosity will go down, heart rate will generally go down with us exercising, stroke volume will go up somewhat, and peripheral resistance will decrease. So effectively, like, your vascular system will get a little bit more pliable and a little bit more loose. Another big thing here, peripheral resistance. If we're overweight or obese or whatever, that is placing more pressure on the cardiovascular system because that weight is staying on top of the arteries, arterioles. So effectively, if an individual just loses a bunch of weight, that should more or less fix blood pressure issues in many cases, not all, of course. All right, so next thing I'm going to talk about here is the electrical activity of the heart. All right, so with electrical activity of the heart, there is so much here, so I'm going to try to abbreviate it as best I can. So contraction of the heart depends on the electrical stimulation of the myocardium. Now, there's different aspects that I want you to be aware of, and there's going to be a memorizable thing showing up here momentarily. So first off, the sinoatrial node, the SA node, really just a bundle of cells that this is collectively called the pacemaker of the heart, and it initiates depolarization or contraction of effectively all of the myocardium, or all of the heart muscle types there. Then that will be passed on to something called the AV node, our arterioventricular node, and that passes depolarization into the ventricles. So up here, SA node, atria, arterioventricular, that's the intersection between atria and ventricles. Then it will be propagated or sent towards more or less the bottom of the heart, the bundle branches, and then Purkinje fibers going through the entirety of it. So let's look at this really quick. Effectively, this is what's going on. SA node, it's going to send a signal to the AV node, and there's something right here called the AV bundle, or the bundle of His, and it's just HIS, bundle of His. That's going to send a message through the bundle branches all the way down to the apex, or the bottom of the heart, and then that's going to send a message on up these Purkinje fibers to contract. So it kind of makes sense that if you're squeezing this out, you want to squeeze from the bottom up, because that's effectively where you're going to be sending the blood to. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, how all of this is represented in kind of a laboratory setting is through something called an electrocardiogram, ECG or EKG. There actually are some differences between Europe and here, between if it's called an ECG or EKG. You can call it whatever, it's fine. This just records the electrical activity of the heart, and there's really only a couple of things that I want you to know about this. And in a cardiac rehab setting, you could effectively diagnose numerous ways different parts of the heart that could have a certain type of electrical issue. Like there's something called like a PR interval, an ST segment. There's the 12 lead system. Effectively, it's looking at the heart from effectively every different angle that you probably could. But here's the main things. I want you to know that a P wave is atrial depolarization, so atrial contraction, QRS complex, is ventricular depolarization, and atrial repolarization, so relaxation, and the T wave is ventricular repolarization, so ventricular relaxation. And you can look at all sorts of abnormalities. Probably the biggest one is an ST segment depression. Or something called a PVC, called premature ventricular contraction. I've actually seen those in a lab before. So I'm not going to get into those too much, but there's really a lot going on here. So P-wave, QRS complex, T-wave, those are the only things that I would really be testing you on going forward. There's a lot of diagnostic use with this. And really, the ST segment depression, I do talk about this a little bit in another class, but I'm not going to talk about it too much in here. It ends up looking something like this, so this would be approximately normal. See, ST, if it's a little bit low, that's related to myocardial ischemia, which if you don't know what ischemia means, it just means lack of blood flow. Going on there. You could look at this a little bit more and try to understand what's going on. It's very interesting, but beyond what's happening in the P wave, QRS complex, and T wave, there's not too much more that I'm going to really ask you about. Now, here there is a relatively large relationship between what's going on in the ECG and blood pressure, but I'm probably not going to ask you too much about that. All right, so next let's move on to some really big deal things. So cardiac output, I've been talking about that quite a bit, and that is notated as Q or sometimes CO. But Q is the most common way that it's done. It is just the product or multiplication of two different variables. And those variables are heart rate and stroke volume. So heart rate, just number of beats per minute, everyone knows how that works. Stroke volume, that is the amount or milliliters of blood ejected per heartbeat. So that's really what's going on there. And it somewhat depends on training state mostly. There might be a little bit to do with gender. However, if you control for body size, it seems to be approximately equaled out there. So here is just a bit of an example of this. So like if we're going through this in some ways, heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, liters per minute going on there. So what's going on that I really want you to be able to know is what's happening at rest and during max exercise for untrained versus trained individuals. So at rest, what's happening is cardiac output is maintained for both trained and untrained individuals, but what happens here is heart rate goes down quite a bit and stroke volume comes up quite a bit. Now at max exercise, interestingly what's happening is cardiac output is not maintained, it actually goes up a lot, and that's due to these two factors. And the reason cardiac output is going up a lot is because trained individuals can just do a whole lot more work than untrained individuals. So think about it running 5 miles an hour versus 10 miles an hour. No wonder it's higher, right? Now, actually, max heart rate, on average, seems to go down just a little bit. So say this is 20-year-old individuals, 220 minus your age, 200 goes down to 190. So exercise training seems to reduce what our max heart rate is, but we have a massive increase in cardiac output due to the extraordinarily high increase in stroke volume. So what a lot of that is, like heart muscle just gets stronger, the left ventricle does. Also, it gets quite a bit bigger. Like the left ventricle just grows in length. Like there's a lot of what's called hypertrophy in series, meaning, stacking actin myosin like long ways next to each other, kind of growing like a snake almost. That's probably a ridiculous way to explain it, but it is what it is. Okay, so here, regulation of heart rate. There's a couple of things going on here that I want us to know. Sorry, I clicked on that a little too quickly. So typically, what's going on that you need to know is the SA node typically beats at around 100 beats per minute. Now, most individuals have a resting heart rate that is below that. So the reason that it is below that is because it is getting parasympathetic or rest and digest stimulation from something called the vagus nerve, or, vagus, that's from the word vagabond or wanderer, which, I'm not going to talk about why that's interesting to me. It's because of a band called Thin Lizzy. That's why I was always very interested in what the vagus nerve is, but that has nothing to do with class. But the vagus nerve, this gives parasympathetic stimulation, and that slows down your heart rate. Now, we have sympathetic stimulation called cardiac accelerator nerves, which effectively send out norepinephrine, that neurotransmitter, to the SA node and AV nodes to contract faster. And I think I just said AV nose. I don't mean nose. I meant node. Sorry. I'll try to stop making so many mistakes. Now, low resting heart rate, that's due to what's called parasympathetic tone or vagal tone. That's what that is. And typically, if someone has a resting heart rate that's below 60 beats per minute, that's called bradycardia. Now, most of you probably have a resting heart rate below that because you exercise and stuff, so that's actually normal. A resting heart rate over 100 beats per minute is called tachycardia. So, I have that, so that's cool, but whatever. Okay, so at the onset of exercise, we actually don't start getting sympathetic stimulation until we get to 100 beats per minute. So we have something called parasympathetic or vagal withdrawal. So we get less parasympathetic nervous stimulation that essentially makes it to where the SA node beats where it normally would. So say we start at 60 beats per minute and then it slowly raises up to 100 beats per minute. There is no fight or flight or sympathetic stimulation yet. Once we hit 101, now there's sympathetic stimulation. Now, 101, that's clearly arbitrary. It's, there's plus or minus on all this stuff, right? But after around 100 beats per minute, then every increase in heart rate after that is due to more norepinephrine or more sympathetic nervous system stimulation. You could look at this in many ways. It's fairly interesting, I think. Just something I want to talk about here really quick, something called beta blockers. It's a drug that has a similar shape to, like these adrenergic catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine. So it will actually bind to these adrenergic receptors and make it to where they will not experience the increases from norepinephrine or whatever. It's given people with tachycardia or people who have stage fright. There's actually some really interesting stuff with individuals that are competitively playing in like symphonies and orchestras, getting prescriptions for beta blockers, and apparently, if you take beta blockers, you don't get stage fright, or if people are afraid of public speaking, then they don't get so much of that. But you know, that's really neither here nor there. Next thing, and I only want to talk about this briefly because it has a lot to do with individuals. I don't know. I see a lot of people trying to sell different trackers that talk about this. So HRV, or heart rate variability. Nah, dang, sorry. There's not a picture of this. What heart rate variability is, a lot of individuals use this as a proxy for how well recovered an individual is. So this is just the variation between R to R intervals. So if you go back and look at the QRS complex, there's a distance between the peak, which is an R, to another peak in an R. So the idea is there is a lot of variation between different R's or heartbeats, a lot of variation in the time between them, and that is indicative of someone being healthy. And whenever there's a low amount of variation, meaning low heart rate variability, it means that you're stressed out or not fully recovered. And I think that this makes sense because whenever we start exercising more, our heart rate goes up. So there's effectively just more QRS complexes, and they get compressed. So the more that they get compressed, there's going to be less variation between them. So effectively, high variation in R to R intervals, or heart rate variability, that really is just an indication that you're well rested. So it might be related to cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, but more research probably needs to be done on that. Let's go ahead and move on to a couple of other terms that I want us to be aware of. So preload and afterload. Preload being another term for this is end diastolic volume. So here, I'm just going to take a step back just for a moment. Why we're interested in this. We were just talking about what causes variation in heart rate. Now we're going to talk about what causes variation in the stroke volume. So keep in mind, this is all related to cardiac output. So for regulation of stroke volume, one thing that will increase stroke volume is a higher end diastolic volume, or EDV, which this is just the volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole, or whenever they've been filled up. Next thing, average aortic blood pressure, or afterload. This is the pressure the heart must pump against to eject blood. So think about how much pressure there is in the aorta, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, all of that type of stuff. So mean arterial pressure. So overall, regulation of stroke volume, if we have a higher end diastolic volume, we're going to have a higher stroke volume. If we have a higher afterload, then we're going to have a lower stroke volume. So if it has to pump blood against a higher blood pressure, then that's going to decrease what our stroke volume is. There's also another aspect, so strength of ventricular contraction. So this is related to kind of the cardiac accelerator nerves, how much circulating epinephrine, norepinephrine, and sympathetic stimulation there is. If there is more sympathetic stimulation, there is going to be more stroke volume being pumped out. Here's just a term that I want you to be aware of. This is kind of like stretching a rubber band more, and then there's a more forceful contract, like snap on the other end of it. So the Frank-Starling mechanism, this is talking about a greater end diastolic volume results in a more forceful contraction. So if we effectively push more blood into the left ventricles, then there's going to be a recoiling effect where more blood will be pumped out in the like a left ventricular contraction or the stroke volume of it. Now, the Frank-Starling mechanism is actually dependent on what's called venous return. So how much blood is being pumped for like back into the vena cava, the pulmonary circuit, and subsequently back into the left ventricle. So venous return, so we get more venous return based upon three different things. So venoconstriction, so whenever we have more sympathetic stimulation, more fight or flight stimulation, we're going to have more constriction or more pressure around the veins. So that is going to ultimately lead to more venous return. Like if it's kind of pressing off of something more rigid, you get a more efficient transfer. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's a little bit opaque, I think, but it is related. Now, these two, I think, should make sense. The skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. So the skeletal muscle pump, this is effectively the contraction relaxation cycles of muscle, which effectively is going to be pressing against the veins, arteries, arteria, just everything going on there. And whenever things are, well, this comes into a concept called simple diffusion. So effectively, things go down a concentration gradient. So if we have high pressure around a muscle and lower pressure away from a muscle, then blood will flow towards the lower pressure area more quickly. And within our veins, there's one-way valves which prevent backflow, more or less. And so that's kind of what's going on there. So the harder the muscles are contracting, the greater the venous return. And lastly, the respiratory pump, which whenever we're breathing harder, there's going to be a lower pressure near where our heart is, so that's going to cause blood to flow more towards our heart a little bit easier going on there. So here, this is just the relationship between EDV and diastolic volume and stroke volume. So as end diastolic volume is going up, there's going to be greater stroke volume, which is related to increased venous return. Now, here is just the skeletal muscle pump. You can look in your book for more information on that. But here is a fairly interesting thing. So end diastolic volume and stroke volume, there's increased contractile strength with greater sympathetic stimulation. So effectively, the left ventricle or myocardium is contracting harder whenever there's more norepinephrine around it. That's really what's going on there. So here, just pretty I wouldn't say it's simple, but these are more or less all of the factors that are impacting cardiac output. So parasympathetic nerves, that reduces heart rate. Sympathetic nerves increases heart rate. Sympathetic nerves also increase contraction strength. So increased contraction strength, will increase stroke volume. Now, stroke volume will be limited or hurt or reduced. Stroke volume will be reduced by higher mean arterial pressure. Greater amounts of end diastolic volume will increase it, and greater amounts of end diastolic volume will increase contraction strength through the stretch or Frank-Starling mechanism. So effectively, all of those don't lose sight of this. Cardiac output, and we need a higher cardiac output to meet our demands for more intense exercise. So let's go ahead and move on to hemodynamics and what's going on there. All right, so in regard to hemodynamics, there are a few things that we need to cover really quick. So first off, plasma. this is the liquid portion of the blood. It mostly contains ions, proteins, hormones, different things like that. Now, plasma also has clotting factors in it, so if you ever work into a lab, you can read about plasma versus serum, and serum doesn't have clotting factors with it. So that's really, that's more or less like a research question. Like, some things travel in plasma, some things like you can take out the clotting factors and it doesn't matter, so serum. Next thing is there's a cell aspect to it. So red blood cells contain hemoglobin. White blood cells, immune system stuff mostly, platelets, and that's really important for blood clotting. And if anybody's interested about me, which you probably shouldn't be, in the lab that I was in at Auburn, I still have the highest circulating platelets that they've measured. Now, I don't know if that means that there's something wrong with me. No, like I don't have clinical levels of platelets, but it's fairly interesting. Hematocrit is really just the percentage of blood that is composed of cells. So if you ever hear of someone talking about hematocrit levels, it is the percentage of cells versus plasma. Now, whenever we start exercising, there is, oh gosh, what is that called? Like exercise-induced anemia or something like that. You can look this up. Whenever we begin exercising, we have a massive increase in plasma first, and then there's a much slower increase in cells. So whenever I was talking about how exercise reduces blood viscosity, the higher amount of cells, the higher the amount of viscosity. So whenever we exercise, we actually have a pretty massive increase in plasma. So that's going to reduce the viscosity because, I know that there's ions, proteins, and stuff, but effectively this is water. And I'm sure many of you actually donate plasma. I used to whenever I was in college. So that's really what's going on there. But here, plasma, so the fluid portion, hematocrit, or essentially cell portion going on down here, which is a mixture of white blood cells, platelets, red blood cells. I remember there was some research that I was a part of where we were extracting just this part right here. So if you ever take someone's blood and you put it in a centrifuge, the spinning causes the amount of force to where the lowest density part, least viscous part, the fluid is on top, and the most viscous part is on bottom. So that's really what's going on there. I'm not going to talk about that too much more. But here's some things that we need to talk about. So blood flow, how does it know where to go? And this is effectively simple diffusion. So there's two aspects of this that I want you to know. So delta pressure, so change in pressure. So hopefully this is obvious, but if it isn't, that's okay. We have the highest pressure in the left ventricle and aorta, and things go down a pressure gradient. So there's a lower pressure in arterioles, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and then finally veins. And the vena cava has a really, really low pressure. So that's how it's going down a concentration gradient of pressure. Now, resistance, that's going to be essentially how much pressure is in a particular area, really. So whenever we're exercising, your cardiovascular system will open up or have a lower pressure towards whatever muscles are actually exercising, and they will constrict around different aspects of your body, normally the gastrointestinal tract, that don't need more fuel. So effectively there will be a lower pressure going towards the muscles, a higher pressure towards the like gastrointestinal tract, kidneys, whatever you don't need at that moment in time. So that's going to direct the blood flow to go to where it needs to go. So here, hopefully, this is making sense. Left ventricle pressure, it's going down all the way until it comes back through the vena cava. And that is just the systemic circuit going on right there. Now, this resistance. So going back, this resistance aspect, that's what I'm going to be talking about. So keep in mind, I'm talking about blood flow, change in pressure, and how can we alter this resistance aspect. So this is where vasodilation, or opening up, or vasoconstriction are really important things going on. So the resistance is related proportionally to the length and viscosity. So essentially length, this, like how long the, I don't know, piping or tubing is, so to speak. You can't really do much about that. Viscosity, so the more viscous, the greater the pressure. How this relates to exercise is whenever we sweat, we start losing some plasma volume. So as you exercise for hours on hours, your blood will actually get more viscous, so there will be a greater resistance. But this is probably the biggest part, the radius to the fourth power. And anytime something is to an exponent, or, well, I mean, shoot, especially to the fourth power, that means it's a huge deal. So what alters resistance the most is the radius of the artery, arterial, capillary, what have you. That's really what's going on there. So whenever it's to the fourth power, that means a little change, and there's some math in the book if you're interested in this. A little change will have a massively huge exponential effect. So if you just close the radius just a little bit, so in the gastrointestinal thing, if we vasoconstrict capillaries, arteries, arterioles going towards our gastrointestinal tract, that's going to increase the resistance there a lot, so blood flow will not go there. Whereas if we open up the arteries, arterioles, capillaries going towards our muscle whenever we're exercising by just a little bit, that's going to reduce resistance a lot. So hopefully that's making sense. That's kind of the main thing that I want you to understand here is radius has the largest impact on resistance, and that is collectively called vasodilation, vasoconstriction, and that will have a large, very large impact on blood flow and where it's going. So places with lower resistance, that's where it's going. With high resistance, it will not go there very much. So here, pictorial representation of effectively the pressure, and this is getting into the simple diffusion idea again. So we go from high pressure areas to lower pressure areas. I'm not really going to talk about that too much more. And here we are getting close to being done with all of this. I'm sorry that this is probably going to be over an hour. So oxygen delivery during exercise. So we have somewhat of a, not really a normal distribution of blood flow during exercise, but we have quite a bit going towards our gastrointestinal tract. There's going to be a picture coming up, but whenever we shift from exercise, we increase our cardiac output by a lot. So our muscles go from a fairly low oxygen demand to a really high oxygen demand. So 15 to 25 times greater than at rest. That's kind of something I want us to know there. And how we get to that is through a massive increase in cardiac output and a redistribution of blood flow from inactive to very active organs. So changes in cardiac output, here's a couple of things there. 220 minus your age, this is really about the main prediction for max heart rate that I want you to know. So this is called age-predicted max heart rate. It's called the Fox method. It's 220 minus your age, and the standard deviation on that is plus or minus 12. So for those of you that are interested, my max heart rate is around 180, 181 maybe. And if you do the math there, I'm quite a bit younger than what it would actually say that I am. But I'm getting older every day, so that's good. But we have a massive increase in heart rate, so there's kind of a peak there. For stroke volume, it seems that in most individuals, there's a peak in stroke volume around 40 to 60% of an individual's VO2 max or peak aerobic capacity. But in highly trained individuals, there seems like there may be no plateau of stroke volume. Now, it makes sense that there is a plateau in stroke volume, just because, well, while you're exercising, your heart doesn't get bigger. But there might be some adaptations from better, more of a Frank Starling mechanism, more sympathetic nervous system stimulation, different things like that might actually impact that quite a bit. So here, you can read about this if you're interested, but 40 to 60% stroke volume plateau in untrained individuals, whereas there doesn't seem to be much of one in highly trained, and I'm saying super highly trained individuals. So there's that. Changes in arterial mix, arterial venous oxygen difference content during exercise. This is related to the Fick equation that we've been talking about quite a bit. So Q, remember cardiac output, AVO2 difference, that is just the amount of oxygen that is in arterial blood minus the amount of oxygen that's in venous blood, and the assumption is that the rest of the oxygen was taken up by whatever tissue. Skeletal muscle is normally what we're thinking of in this. Here, yeah, that's approximately okay going on there. Now here are some different cardiovascular variables that I want us to know what the relationship is. So in regard to blood pressure, systolic blood pressure increases linearly with exercise. So with exercise intensity. So bear in mind percent VO2 max down here. So systolic blood pressure, and look in your book for this, it will go up linearly with exercise. And in other classes, I show you somewhat of a relationship between like METs and heart rate and every like 10 millimeters of mercury, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Mean arterial pressure will also go up linearly. Now, diastolic blood pressure seems to either have no effect or go down a little bit as we increase exercise intensity. Stroke volume, in most individuals, not highly trained, it seems to plateau around 40 to 60% and stay about there. Now, in highly trained, it might go up. Cardiac output, which is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, there's a reason that there's two different slopes here, and that's because that first slope is where both are going up in a linear fashion, because heart rate goes up in a linear fashion with VO2 max or exercise intensity. And then once we reach a certain point, stroke volume is no longer increasing, and all of the increases in cardiac output are driven solely by heart rate. Now, one that we haven't talked about yet, we talked about a little bit in the past slide, arteriovenous oxygen difference. This is essentially how much oxygen your skeletal muscle is able to take up. And it increases linearly with exercise for a bit, and then there's a slightly smaller slope. And that is mostly due to this cardiac output having two different slopes. Notice they're in approximately the same area. So if you put more in, you get more out. So your skeletal muscle will take up more oxygen if there's more blood and oxygen circulating around that muscle. So that's really what's going on there. So there is a limit to that. Like, we can only have so much myoglobin and so many mitochondria within a particular skeletal muscle. So bear that in mind, but those are the general relationships that I want you to be aware of. Be aware of which ones have two slopes and which ones go up linearly with exercise intensity. So here, going back to redistribution of blood flow, the redistribution mostly is dependent on metabolic rate. So at rest, cardiac output is fairly low to muscle, about a fifth of it is going there, to almost all of it whenever we're exercising at max. At rest, we have a lot of blood flow in our gastrointestinal tract, and then much less whenever we start exercising. Here, splenic, splanchic, a very difficult word for me to say, more or less means spleen. So that's going down. Muscle blood flow is going up in relationship to exercise intensity. I think everyone's somewhat aware of this right here. I think this explains it very well. So heavy exercise, rest, keep this in mind. Cardiac output, heavy exercise, 25 liters per minute, so 5 times what it is at rest. 5 there. We have 20-25% going to our gastrointestinal tract, all sorts of things there. Fairly low amount going to the muscle, but then at heavy exercise, the total amount goes up a lot, and almost all of it is going towards muscle. So that's because that is where the highest metabolic activity is. Here, there is some things going on with how we direct it. So vasodilation, vasoconstriction, broadly meaning opening of the radius or closing of the radius of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, everything like that. What seems to be going on here is overall, the sympathetic nervous system has a vasoconstrictive effect. So if you go back and look at like alpha adrenergic receptors, that's kind of what's going on here versus beta adrenergic receptors. But I'm not going to try to confuse you with too much of that. But a skeletal muscle that is having a high amount of energy demand will frequently send out signals that will cause vasodilation towards wherever that skeletal muscle is, directing blood flow in that direction. Whereas various organs, like the visceral or gut organs, are inactive and will not send out those signals. So some of the signals are changes in oxygen. So a lower oxygen, great amount of tension, CO2, nitric oxide. Various people who take NOS or arginine supplements trying to increase the amount of nitric oxide or nitric oxide synthase. There's a few different types of nitric oxide synthase, but eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, seems to be one of the main ones that we're really worried about. Seems to, kind of like open some things up. If anybody remembers like myokines, IL-6, different like BDNF, a lot of these will be secreted from a skeletal muscle to have more or less a paracrine effect on opening up endothelial cells that are near it to try to direct blood flow going that direction. So nitric oxide is an important vasodilator. So it promotes relaxation in smooth muscles. And nitric oxide, kind of beginning, is made out of one of our conditionally essential or non-essential amino acids, arginine. So there's some kind of interesting stuff going on there. Now, here, let's just finish this up a little bit. So circulatory responses to exercise. So there are changes in heart rate and blood pressure, and this is very dependent on type, intensity, and duration of exercise, as well as environmental conditions. So if it's hot or cool. I think a lot of this makes sense. So really with arm exercise, there's going to be higher intensity and higher blood pressure, higher heart rate, because arm muscles are smaller, so to have a similar work output, they're going to have to work harder than the legs, more or less. Now with environmental aspects, we're going to be losing plasma volume, so viscosity is going to go up. And we're going to essentially lose, well, here, let's see if we get into that. It doesn't seem like we're going to, so I'm going to talk about this. The longer we exercise in a hot, humid environment, we start getting dehydrated, so we lose blood volume. So as we lose blood volume, we're going to have a reduction in stroke volume. And to maintain cardiac output, we're going to have a higher and higher heart rate, and this is called cardiac drift. So whenever we have a slowly increasing heart rate, slowly declining stroke volume due to plasma volume loss in sweat, that's kind of what's going on to maintain cardiac output. Now here, I'm not going to talk about this. There is somewhat of an emotional influence on heart rate. So those of you that have put on heart rate monitors and got up in front of everybody and said, oh gosh, my heart rate's so high in front of everybody, there is like an emotional or affective response there. So really just sympathetic nervous system activity is going up in that respect. So whenever we have here, almost done, we're going to have a transition from rest to exercise. So whenever we begin exercise, we have a rapid increase in heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output because that's the product of those two. And then it will plateau once we reach a certain level. Now during recovery, there will be a decrease in heart rate, stroke volume. Now something interesting here is that we can actually measure someone's cardiovascular fitness, and this is from various like Queen's College step tests or things like that. We get someone exercising at a relatively hard rate, and then we start measuring how quickly their heart rate recovers. And this is because individuals that are more highly trained get their heart rate and stroke volume and everything back to resting levels at a much more rapid pace. That's really the main thing that I want you to know from there. So here are some relationships with from rest to exercise. So cardiac output, heart rate, stroke volume, they all go up, they plateau, and then they will come down somewhat slowly. A more fit individual will come back down to rest sooner. Now with incremental exercise, we have it essentially is going to just continue to go up with increasing exercise intensities. Now we will hit a plateau or 100% of someone's heart rate max and cardiac output, and blood pressure much the same way. And we've talked about this already, that systolic blood pressure increases, diastolic blood pressure seems to be somewhat constant. Now in another class I talk about this more. I just want to talk about it really quick. There's something called a double product or rate pressure product, frequently shown as RPP. And all that this is the multiplication or product of heart rate and systolic blood pressure. So this actually has a direct, almost perfect relationship with left ventricular myocardial oxygen uptake. So if you're ever working in cardiac rehab, rate pressure product might be the best way to see where someone's left ventricle is or how their heart function is if you don't have higher tech equipment, because taking someone's blood pressure and their heart rate is relatively simple compared to hooking them up to an EKG or doing an echocardiogram or anything like that. And it's a low-cost way to actually see a lot. And various individuals after heart attacks or whatever, they have a certain level that they can get their rate pressure product up to and not beyond that. And it's actually a really good diagnostic tool for a lot of things. So it's a good way to see left ventricular myocardial oxygen consumption, and also just total amount of work that the circulatory system is having to go through. Because systolic blood pressure, that's the highest pressure, and heart rate, that's the amount of times that it has to experience the highest pressure. So that's going to tell us quite a bit about what's going on with all of that. So here is some relatively interesting stuff going on with the rate pressure product. You can call it the double product if you want to. I first learned it as the rate pressure product. Now here, I'm not really going to talk about intermittent exercise, but with prolonged exercise, this is the cardiovascular drift that I was talking about prior. So cardiac output is maintained whenever we're exercising at a given workload. Stroke volume is going down due to sweating and loss of plasma volume. And heart rate will go up to essentially maintain cardiac output. Here I'm not going to talk about sudden cardiac death. I talk about that in other classes. But essentially that is it for circulatory responses. I'll see you in the next one with respiration.